My only boy vanished without a single trace, but not before quietly placing a $3 million fortune safely into my personal bank account. His vicious wife showed up at my front door demanding every last cent, absolutely convinced she had cornered a fragile, helpless old woman. She smiled that wicked, confident smile of hers, right up until the exact moment I pressed play on a secret audio recording that brought her entire world crashing down. I am Brenda, 68 years old, a retired high school principal. For 40 long years I have walked this earth as a widow. I worked my fingers to the bone, taking on extra shifts and tutoring on weekends just to put food on our table. I poured every drop of my strength, my sweat and my prayers into raising my only child, Jamal. I gladly sacrificed my own youth so he could build a beautiful future. And my boy made me so proud, growing into a brilliant, successful tech entrepreneur. Jamal is my entire universe, the very beat of my heart. But the peaceful, quiet retirement I worked so hard for was ripped away on a dark, stormy Tuesday night. The rain was beating heavily against my windows when my phone suddenly vibrated with an urgent alert from my bank. I put on my glasses and stared at the screen in pure shock. $3 million had just been transferred directly into my name. A second later, a text message from Jamal came through. It read, "Mum, do not trust anyone. Stay alive." My blood turned to ice. I dialed his number over and over my hands, shaking uncontrollably, but it went straight to voicemail. I paced the floor all night, praying to God to protect my son. But the panic had barely set in when the very next morning brought a walking nightmare right to my front door. Chloe, my son's white wife, barged into my living room without so much as a knock. Trailing right behind her was her deadbeat brother, Bradley. Chloe did not look like a worried wife whose husband was missing. She looked like a hungry predator smelling blood. She marched straight up to my coffee table, violently slammed a piece of paper down on the wood, and looked me dead in the eye. I stared at the paper. It was a death certificate, a forged, filthy piece of paper officially declaring my beautiful boy dead. Before I could even process the horror of what I was looking at, she crossed her arms, smirked, and demanded, "I hand over her rightful inheritance, every single penny of that $3 million, looking at that terrible piece of paper on my coffee table." My mind instantly pulled me back to the hardest years of my life. After my husband passed away, it was just Jamal and me against a world that was not designed for a widowed black woman to succeed. I started out as a substitute teacher, working long and exhausting hours, and eventually climbed the ranks to become a high school principal. But getting there was a path paved with pure grit and deep humiliation. I distinctly remember the loan officers who looked right through me. Their dismissive smirks when I asked for funds to help send my brilliant boy to a top-tier tech academy. I swallowed that disrespect. I smiled politely and walked out only to take on 3 extra jobs. I tutored on weekends, graded papers late into the cold night, and even cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods across town. There were countless nights I went to bed with nothing but a glass of water in my stomach, just so Jamal could have a hot meal and a new textbook. I wore the same threadbare winter coat for 10 years. Every dollar I stretched, every aching muscle, and every single tear I hid from him was a direct investment in his future. I poured my absolute soul into that boy. And Jamal knew it. He grew up seeing my daily sacrifices and matched them with his own relentless ambition. We had a bond, woven from survival and profound love. He was my absolute pride, a brilliant tech entrepreneur who beat all the odds stacked against us. I trusted my son with every fiber of my being. We were an unbreakable team, anchored by deep respect and a shared history of overcoming every obstacle thrown our way. I never doubted his love for me, not for a single second, but the pure, untainted joy of our little family began to sour the very moment he brought a certain woman into our lives. Everything shifted the day Jamal married Chloe. I tried my hardest to welcome her with open arms, praying she would be the supportive partner my son deserved. But Chloe made her disdain clear from day one. Whenever she visited my cozy, modest home, her pale blue eyes would scan my worn furniture with undisguised judgment. She complained about the neighborhood, the food I spent hours cooking, and the simple way I lived. It was always a thinly veiled insult, wrapped in a fake, polite smile. And then there was her brother Bradley. He was a notorious deadbeat, a man drowning in gambling debts, who always seemed to be hovering around my son's newly acquired wealth. Bradley and Chloe would sit right in my living room making snide, cruel comments about my background. They mocked the very struggles that built the solid foundation of Jamal's success. They made me feel like an outsider in my own family, two arrogant white Americans who felt completely entitled to the empire. A black mother and son had bled to build. I watched in absolute agony as Jamal slowly transformed. The vibrant, joyful boy I raised became a hollow shadow of himself. He grew incredibly haggard, losing weight rapidly and hiding dark, heavy circles under his eyes. He worked frantically, burying himself in his company late into the night. But it was not the healthy drive of a passionate entrepreneur. It was pure, suffocating anxiety. I could practically see the tension radiating from his tired shoulders, the deep fear lingering in his eyes. Every single time Chloe or Bradley entered the room, my heart broke watching my beautiful boy suffer under their toxic, heavy presence, yet I bit my tongue. I swallowed the heavy disrespect, the cruel mockery, and the profound hurt, enduring it all, simply to keep the peace. I desperately wanted to protect his marriage, believing with all my heart that a mother should never be the wedge in her son's home. I stayed entirely silent, hoping my quiet patience would shield him from further pain, completely unaware of the deadly, vicious trap they were actively laying out for him. Right there in the middle of my cozy living room, the polite mask completely slipped off Chloe's face. If you expected to see a devastated, grieving widow weeping for her missing husband, you would be gravely disappointed. Not a single tear fell from her cold, icy blue eyes. Instead, she stood with her hands planted firmly on her hips, looking around my modest home as if it were a dumpster and treating me like the trash inside it. She paced across my worn floral rug and began her verbal assault. She told me to stop playing the fool and drop the innocent mother routine. She screamed that everyone knew Jamal transferred the company funds to my personal account right before his supposed fatal accident. She looked me dead in the eye and called me a senile old black woman who had absolutely no business holding on to $3 million. She actually had the nerve to slide a silver pen across my coffee table, tapping her long, manicured fingernails against the glass. She demanded I sign a broad power of attorney right then and there, surrendering every single dime to her. She claimed she needed the money immediately to handle his final arrangements and secure the future of the tech company he left behind. I just stared at her, trying to process the absolute wickedness radiating from her pores. That is when her deadbeat brother Bradley stepped forward to finish the job. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, puffing himself up to intimidate me. He hovered over my small sofa, casting a dark, heavy shadow over my body, and sneered. He told me, in a low, menacing tone, that if I did not sign those legal papers immediately, he would personally call the police and report me for harboring stolen corporate assets. He had the absolute audacity to accuse my hard-working, honest son of being a white-collar criminal who embezzled funds to run away. Bradley threatened to have me thrown in a federal prison for aiding and abetting a fugitive. He leaned down so close I could smell the stale, bitter coffee on his breath, and told me that a helpless old woman like me would not survive a week behind bars. They genuinely thought they had me completely cornered. They looked at my simple cardigan, my greying hair and my age, and they saw an easy mark. They thought I was just an ignorant retired school principal who would cower and surrender at the first sign of legal trouble. They wanted to erase my beautiful son from this earth and walk away with the massive empire we built together from the ground up. I knew right then and there that I had to play their wicked game if I wanted to survive and protect my boy. So I let my shoulders slump forward, perfectly mimicking a defeated, broken woman. I buried my wrinkled face deep into my hands, and I began to weep loudly, forcing heavy sobs to shake my entire chest. I made my hands tremble violently as I reached out, grabbing a tissue from the side table to wipe my eyes. I pleaded with them in a broken, fragile voice, begging them to please give a grieving mother just a few days to process the heartbreaking, devastating loss of her only child. I told them. My mind was a thick fog of unbearable sorrow, and I could not possibly focus enough to read or sign any complicated legal documents in such a fragile, emotional state. Chloe rolled her eyes in sheer disgust and let out an exasperated, dramatic sigh. But Bradley nodded greedily, thinking their intimidation tactics had already worked perfectly. They gave me exactly 72 hours to hand over the $3 million before they would come marching back with the authorities. The very second, my front door clicked shut, and I heard their heavy luxury car speed away down my quiet street. My tears instantly stopped. I stood up from my sofa and squared my shoulders, lifting my chin high. I did not collapse onto the floor. I did not break down in despair. The righteous, burning anger erupting deep inside my chest completely evaporated any lingering trace of fear. A mother possesses a primal, powerful instinct that no forged death certificate can ever override. Deep in my soul, I felt an undeniable pull telling me that my boy was still breathing. Jamal was out there somewhere, hiding in the shadows and waiting for me to uncover the ugly truth. I began to pace the length of my living room, slowly piecing together the subtle, strange clues I had blindly missed over the past month. I vividly remembered the heavy, suffocating panic in his dark eyes when he visited me for Sunday dinner last week. He could barely eat his food, constantly checking out the front window and pacing back and forth across my kitchen tiles. And then a sudden memory hit me like a bolt of lightning. Before he left that evening, he had gone into my guest bedroom to lie down, claiming he had a terrible migraine. When he finally came out, he had intentionally left behind his old, worn-out college jacket, hanging quietly in the guest room closet. Jamal never went anywhere without a jacket, and he certainly never left his personal belongings scattered around my house. My heart began to pound, a steady, fierce rhythm of absolute determination against my ribs. I walked straight down the hallway toward the guest room with my mind laser-focused. I was not some helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered, and I was certainly not going down without a fight. I walked down the quiet hallway of my home with a heavy heart but a completely clear mind. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my feet, a familiar sound that usually brought me peace, but today it felt like the ticking of a clock. I pushed open the door to the guest bedroom and stepped inside. The room was dim, with the afternoon light barely peeking through the closed blinds. I walked straight to the closet and pulled the wooden doors apart. Right there, hanging quietly among a few spare blankets, was Jamal's old college Letterman jacket. The sight of it brought a lump to my throat. I remembered the exact day I bought that jacket for him, working double shifts at the school, just so my boy could walk across his campus, feeling proud. I reached out and took the heavy wool garment off the hanger. As I brought it close to my face, I could smell the faint, lingering scent of his favorite sandalwood cologne, mixed with something else. Something that smelled like cold, metallic fear. I ran my hands over the dark fabric, pressing my fingers into the sleeves and the pockets. I knew my son better than anyone on this earth. Jamal never left his belongings scattered around my house, and he certainly would never leave this prized jacket behind unless he was trying to tell me something. I pressed my palms against the chest of the jacket, moving down toward the inner lining. Suddenly, my fingertips brushed against a small, hard rectangle near the bottom hem. It was hidden deep inside the fabric, completely invisible from the outside. My breath hitched in my chest. I hurried over to my old sewing kit on the dresser, grabbed my sharpest pair of fabric shears, and carefully snipped the thick threads holding the inner lining together. My hands were shaking so violently that I accidentally pricked my own finger. But I did not care about the pain. I reached into the open seam and pulled out a tiny black flash drive, tightly wrapped in waterproof electrical tape. I stood there in the quiet bedroom, staring at the small piece of plastic in my palm. My heart pounded a fierce, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I knew right then that this was the answer to the nightmare I had been living for the past 24 hours. I took the flash drive and marched straight into my home office, locking the door firmly behind me. I sat down in my heavy leather desk chair and booted up my laptop. The few seconds it took for the computer screen to glow brightly felt like an absolute eternity. I peeled the black tape off the drive with trembling fingers and plugged it into the side port of my computer. A single folder popped up on the screen immediately. It was titled simply for Mum. I closed my eyes for a brief second, praying to God to give me the strength to handle whatever I was about to see. I double-clicked the folder. The screen instantly filled with dozens of documents, financial spreadsheets, and a single audio file named The Truth. I did not know where to begin, so I clicked on the first spreadsheet. My eyes scanned row after row of glaring red numbers. They were banking records from Jamal's tech company. I leaned in closer to the screen, my stomach dropping as I read the details. Massive, unauthorized wire transfers had been bleeding the corporate accounts dry for the past 8 months. Millions of dollars had been quietly siphoned off and funneled into shady offshore shell companies. I looked at the digital signature stamps authorizing the transfers. They were incredibly clever forgeries. But I noticed the administrative login credentials belonged to Chloe. As his wife and the company marketing director, she had top-level access, and she had completely abused it. I clicked on a folder labeled Bradley. Inside were screenshots of emails and text messages that made my blood run absolutely cold. They were brutal, violent demands for payment from dangerous underground loan sharks. Bradley had racked up a massive, suffocating gambling debt. The messages threatened to break his legs and put him in a pine box if the money was not delivered by the end of the month. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. Chloe was stealing millions from my brilliant, hard-working son to save her deadbeat brother from the criminal underworld. She was draining the empire Jamal and I sacrificed our lives to build just to cover Bradley's pathetic mistakes. But the financial betrayal was nothing compared to the pure, unadulterated evil waiting for me in the audio file. I took a deep breath, grabbed my headphones, and clicked play on the file named The Truth. At first, there was only the muffled sound of fabric shuffling, as if a phone had been secretly hidden inside a pocket or dropped under a sofa cushion. Then, Chloe's voice cut through the silence of my office. It was cold, calculating, and completely devoid of a single ounce of human empathy. She was arguing intensely with Bradley. Bradley was panicking, his voice pitching high with terror, whining that the loan sharks were going to kill him if they did not get their money by Friday. Chloe told him to shut his mouth and listen. She hissed that Jamal had just run an audit on the accounting software and found the massive discrepancies. She admitted that Jamal knew she stole the money, and that he was preparing to go straight to the police and file for an immediate divorce. Bradley started sobbing on the recording, begging her to fix it. That is when Chloe's voice dropped to a deadly, sinister whisper that froze the very marrow in my bones. She told her brother that Jamal could not go to the police or file for divorce if he was dead. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. I sat paralyzed in my chair, forced to listen as my vicious daughter-in-law laid out a sickening, meticulously planned murder scheme. She told Bradley that she had already contacted a professional fixer from the dark web. They were going to tamper with the brake lines on Jamal's car before he drove back down the steep mountain road from his upcoming tech retreat. She wanted to make it look like a tragic, unfortunate traffic accident. Chloe then actually laughed about the massive life insurance policy she had recently secretly doubled on him. She gloated that as his grieving widow, she would instantly inherit his entire company, all his hidden assets, and the life insurance payout. Bradley asked what they were going to do about me. Chloe laughed that cruel, demonic laugh again. She told her brother that the pathetic old black woman would be too busy weeping over a closed casket to ever question the official police report. I ripped the headphones off my ears, gasping for air as if I had been physically punched in the stomach. The sheer terrifying magnitude of their wickedness was suffocating. They did not just want to rob my son, they wanted to slaughter him like an animal for a payout. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to look back at the computer screen. There was one final document left, to open a plain text file written by Jamal. I opened it, and my son's words filled my vision. He wrote that he had confronted Chloe about the stolen money, but he noticed she was acting far too calm for someone about to go to prison. His intuition told him to hide a recording device in their living room. When he heard the audio of them planning his murder, he knew he was completely out of time. The police would need months to build a corporate fraud and attempted murder case, and Chloe's hired killer was already watching him. Jamal explained that he had absolutely no choice but to drop completely off the grid to protect his own life. Before he vanished, he liquidated the last $3 million he had full control over, completely bypassing Chloe's financial reach, and safely wired it into my private account. He wrote that he was currently hiding in a secure, undisclosed location, working covertly with a private federal investigator to secure the final irrefutable proof needed to lock Chloe and Bradley in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their miserable lives. Jamal begged me to stay strong, to play along with their sick game, and to guard the $3 million with my life, until he gave me the signal that it was safe. He ended the letter by telling me how much he loved me, and that he was coming back to me soon. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the wall. The agonizing grief and terror that had consumed me for the past 24 hours completely vanished. Every single tear dried up, replaced by a burning, explosive, motherly rage. I thought about Chloe marching into my home, tossing a fake death certificate in my face, and smiling at me, while she believed my beautiful boy was lying dead at the bottom of a ravine. She thought I was just a weak, grieving old lady who would hand over millions of dollars out of pure fear. She thought she had outsmarted a retired educator who spent 40 years dealing with every kind of liar and manipulator walking this earth. I closed my laptop and locked the flash drive safely inside my heavy iron floor safe. I walked over to the mirror hanging in my office and looked at my reflection. My posture was perfectly straight, my jaw set like stone. I was no longer a mourning mother waiting for a tragedy. I was a fierce, relentless protector preparing for war. Chloe and Bradley wanted to play a wicked game of deception and greed, but they had severely miscalculated. They woke up the wrong woman, and I was going to gladly watch them dig their own graves. 3 days passed in absolute agonizing silence. I stayed inside my home, watching the hands on my grandfather clock move with painful slowness. I was ready. I had my phone fully charged and connected directly to the premium surround sound speakers my brilliant boy had installed in my living room last Christmas. I had placed the heavy iron safe key securely in my pocket. Every single fiber of my being was on high alert. I was a mother, waiting for the predators to return to the nest, and I did not have to wait long. The violent pounding on my front door echoed through the quiet house just past noon. Before I could even reach the entryway, the heavy wooden door was shoved open with brute force. Chloe marched into my sanctuary as if she were a conquering general entering a defeated village. She wore a sharp, expensive white designer suit that she probably bought using my son's stolen corporate funds. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, and her icy blue eyes locked onto me with pure, unadulterated malice. Trailing right behind her was Bradley, cracking his thick knuckles and carrying a heavy leather briefcase. But they were not alone this time. They brought a third man with them. He was a tall, nervous-looking white man in a cheap, wrinkled suit, clutching a stack of legal folders. He looked around my living room, shifting uncomfortably on his feet like a cornered rat. Chloe did not even bother offering a fake greeting. She walked right up to my coffee table and slammed a thick stack of legal documents down onto the glass. The sound made me jump, but I kept my face perfectly arranged in a mask of fearful confusion. I asked her what she was doing in my home. Chloe crossed her arms and let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She told me the Grieving Widow Act was officially over and that my time was up. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger at the nervous man standing by the door and introduced him as her personal attorney. She proudly announced that he had spent the last 3 days drafting a formal petition to the state court, declaring me entirely mentally incompetent and unfit to manage my own finances. My heart raced, but not from fear. It raced because they were falling directly into the very trap Jamal and I had prepared. I looked at the papers on the table. The bold black letters at the top of the page literally requested that the state strip me of my human rights and hand total control of my $3 million over to my daughter-in-law. I looked up at Chloe and let my voice shake slightly. I asked her how she could possibly do something so wicked to the woman who loved her husband. Chloe stepped closer, entirely dropping her polite society act. Her face contorted into an ugly, hateful sneer. She leaned down into my face and told me that she was entirely sick and tired of playing house with my family. She said I was nothing but a senile old black woman who got lucky because her son figured out how to code. She demanded I pick up a pen and sign the transfer documents immediately. If I signed, she promised to let me live out the rest of my pathetic days in this dusty little house. But if I refused, she threatened to drag me into a courtroom, have a judge declare me legally insane, and lock me away in a state-run psychiatric ward where they would pump me full of sedatives until I forgot my own name. She promised me that once I was locked away, she would personally drain every single cent of that $3 million and never look back. Bradley decided to join the psychological warfare. He stepped up right beside his sister, using his massive physical size to box me into the corner of my own living room. He sneered down at me, telling me that a stubborn old woman like me did not stand a chance against their lawyers. He warned me that if I made them go to court, he would personally ensure the staff at the psych ward made my life a living hell. The fake lawyer cleared his throat nervously and told me it would be in my best financial and medical interest to just sign the papers and avoid a messy public spectacle. They had me completely surrounded. They were 3 arrogant predators, looming over a 68-year-old woman expecting me to break down and surrender my entire life to them. But I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not fall to my knees. The fear that I had been carefully projecting for the last 3 days completely evaporated. I slowly stood up from my sofa, pushing my shoulders back and lifting my chin. I smoothed down the front of my cardigan with absolute deliberate calmness. I looked Chloe dead in her icy blue eyes, and I let her see the fierce, powerful woman who had commanded crowded school auditoriums and disciplined unruly teenagers for 40 years. I saw a tiny flicker of confusion cross her face. She expected a weeping victim, but she was staring at a stone wall. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not break eye contact with Chloe as I tapped the screen and opened the hidden audio file Jamal had captured. I pressed play and maximized the volume. The crystal-clear sound of Chloe's own voice suddenly blasted through the premium surround sound speakers, echoing off the walls of my living room. Her recorded voice filled the air, whining about the stolen corporate funds and outlining the exact terrifying details of how she had hired a dark web mechanic to sabotage the brake lines on Jamal's car. The speakers vibrated as Bradley's recorded voice panicked about his loan shark debts, followed by Chloe's sickening demonic laugh as she bragged about collecting Jamal's doubled life insurance policy. The transformation in my living room was instant and absolutely glorious. The arrogant sneer on Chloe's face melted away completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost. Bradley stumbled backward, gasping for air as if the oxygen had just been sucked out of the room. The fake lawyer dropped his briefcase onto the floor, sending papers scattering everywhere. He raised his hands in surrender and immediately backed toward the front door, desperately trying to distance himself from the monumental crime that was playing through my speakers. Chloe began to shake violently. She looked wildly around the room, trying to find the source of the audio. She screamed at me, demanding to know what I was playing and where I had gotten that recording. I simply smiled at her, a cold, unforgiving smile, and told her that she made a very grave mistake when she assumed Jamal was as foolish as she was. Bradley's shock suddenly turned into desperate, violent rage. He realized that if that recording got out, his life was over. He lunged forward, reaching his thick, heavy hands out to grab my phone and smash it to pieces. He screamed that he was going to destroy the device and silence me for good, but before his hands could even graze my clothing, the heavy wooden door to my kitchen was violently kicked open. It slammed against the drywall with a massive, deafening crash that shook the entire house. Bradley froze in his tracks. Chloe spun around, letting out a blood-curdling shriek of pure horror, stepping out of the shadows of my kitchen. Looking perfectly healthy and radiating absolute fury was my beautiful son, Jamal. He stood tall and commanding, staring down the woman who had tried to slaughter him for a payout. Chloe collapsed onto her knees, her hands gripping her hair as she stared at her husband, like she was looking at a man who had just risen from the dead. She could not speak. She could only let out pathetic, broken, gasping sounds. But Jamal was not alone. Marching out right behind him were two towering federal agents wearing dark suits and clearly displaying their heavy tactical gear. And stepping out right beside them was Attorney Jackson, my brilliant, fiercely loyal legal counsel, holding a thick leather binder and looking at the fake lawyer with utter professional disgust. The sheer, magnificent power of that moment washed over my soul like a healing rain. The third power had officially arrived, and the arrogance of the predators in my living room was completely crushed into dust. One of the federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Bradley by his shoulder and slamming him hard against the living room wall. Bradley cried out in pain as the agent swiftly kicked his legs apart and forcefully yanked his arms behind his back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs over his wrists. The second agent walked straight toward Chloe, who was still sobbing hysterically on my floral rug. He hauled her to her feet by her expensive white jacket and secured her wrists in tight iron cuffs. Attorney Jackson stepped over the scattered papers on the floor and looked directly at the trembling, fake lawyer who was currently pressing himself into the corner, trying to become invisible. Attorney Jackson informed the man that he was formally charging him with conspiracy to commit fraud and aiding in the attempted exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen. The fake lawyer began to weep, begging for mercy, and claiming Chloe had lied to him about my mental state. Attorney Jackson coldly advised him to save his tears for the federal judge. Jamal walked slowly across the room, stepping right past his treacherous handcuffed wife without giving her a single ounce of sympathy. He walked straight into my arms, wrapping me in the tightest, warmest hug I had ever felt in my entire life. I buried my face in his chest, holding my boy, breathing in the scent of him, and thanking God for bringing him back to me safe and sound. Chloe struggled against the federal agent, holding her, desperately looking at Jamal, with mascara running down her pale face. She begged Jamal to listen to her screaming that the recording was manipulated and that she never wanted him dead. She pleaded for his forgiveness, swearing that she loved him and that they could fix their marriage. Jamal pulled back from our hug and turned to look at the monster he had once called his wife. He stood with the calm, powerful dignity of a man who had entirely reclaimed his life. He looked her up and down with absolute disgust and told her that her cheap, pathetic lies were finally over. He informed her that the federal agents had already raided her secret offshore accounts, seized her brother's illegal assets, and arrested the mechanic she had hired to cut his brake lines. Jamal told her in a voice as cold as ice that she was going to spend the best years of her miserable life rotting in a federal prison cell. The agent shoved Chloe forward, reading her the Miranda rights loudly and clearly as he dragged her out of my front door. Bradley was dragged out right behind her, cursing and crying like a defeated coward. The neighbors had all gathered on their front lawns, watching in absolute shock as the arrogant, wealthy white couple who had terrorized my son was shoved into the back of a dark federal vehicle. Attorney Jackson gathered the fake mental incompetence papers from my coffee table, securing them in his binder as direct evidence for the prosecution. He tipped his hat to me, giving me a warm, respectful smile, and followed the agents out into the afternoon sun. The house was suddenly quiet again, but it was no longer a silence filled with fear and anxiety. It was a beautiful, victorious peace. Jamal and I stood alone in the center of my living room, looking at the empty space where the monsters had just stood. We had won. The $3 million was safe. The criminal empire was destroyed, and my brilliant boy was finally completely free. All the terrifying darkness they had brought into our lives was gone, swept away by the undeniable power of a mother's fierce protective love. The trial was swift and absolute. Chloe and Bradley stood before the federal judge, completely stripped of their arrogance, their fake smiles, and their expensive designer clothes. The mountain of evidence my son and the investigators compiled was undeniably crushing. The illegal wire transfers, the dark web contracts with the hitman, and that damning audio recording we played in my living room sealed their fate forever. They were both sentenced to 30 years in a federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of parole. They lost every single thing they tried so ruthlessly to steal, trading their luxury cars and lavish lifestyles for cold iron bars and concrete walls. I watched Chloe being led away in shackles. Her icy blue eyes finally filled with the genuine terror she had tried to inflict upon us. When the judge brought down the gavel, the deafening sound echoed like pure, undeniable justice. I turned to my beautiful boy Jamal, and we held each other tightly, letting our tears of sheer relief and joy fall freely in the middle of that courtroom. The heavy, suffocating nightmare that had terrorized our family was finally over. The $3 million that Jamal had trusted me to protect became the solid foundation of our fresh start. He poured those funds directly back into rebuilding his tech company, structuring it this time with an ironclad team of loyal, trustworthy partners who truly respected our journey. We moved forward, leaving the betrayal and the toxic predators in the dust. Today my son is thriving. His anxiety is gone, and our bond is stronger than it has ever been. We live our lives peacefully, breathing the sweet air of freedom and walking with our heads held incredibly high. We survived the absolute darkest storm, and we emerged brilliantly victorious. Looking back on this entire horrifying ordeal, I have learned a profound, hard-earned lesson that I want to share with every mother and every generous soul listening to my voice today. Love does not mean blindness. We can pour our entire hearts and souls into our children, sacrificing our youth to build their future. But we must also keep our eyes wide open to the people they bring into our lives. Never let anyone mistake your kindness for weakness. Your quiet patience should never be seen as an open invitation for disrespect or abuse. We work entirely too hard to let greedy, toxic predators trample over our dignity and steal our peace. Stand firm in your truth, fiercely protect what is yours, and never apologize for defending your family. If you liked my story, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Your wonderful support is the true motivation for me to keep telling these real-life stories. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.